Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. In the latest display of deepening ties between Beijing and Moscow, Chinese and Russian troops are engaged in a large-scale military exercise in northwestern China. The exercise, codenamed Zapad/Interaction 2021, began on August 9 and will conclude on coming Friday. More than 10,000 troops from the Chinese and Russian militaries are participating in the drills that involve large number of aircraft and other weapon systems. This year's drills mark the fourth consecutive exercises between Beijing and Moscow and the first joint drills being held in China. Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman Wu Xian said the goal was to consolidate cooperation and maintain regional peace and security. He also spoke about focusing on counterterrorism and establishing a joint command center for better cooperation on joint reconnaissance, early warnings, joint strikes, and electronic and information attacks. The U.S. believes these exercises are meant to enhance interoperability, encourage defense industrial collaboration, send signals to third parties, and promote mutual reassurance and confidence building. With the region's security environment deteriorating, including, though not confined to U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, what does enhanced Sino-Russian joint capabilities mean for CT operations and also more traditional ground, air, and naval operations? To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Ankerson, Clinical Associate Professor of Global Affairs at New York University, Dr. Pavel Luzin, a specialist in international relations and an expert on Russian armed forces, and Chen Shizhong, a former senior colonel, who is now visiting professor at Southwest University of Political Science and Law. Thank you to all my panelists. Let me begin with Professor Ankerson here. So, Professor Ankerson, how does the United States approach this? There are these two sovereign countries, they're neighbors, they have a certain convergence of interests and also threat perceptions. Does the United States really feel threatened by enhanced interoperability and defense cooperation between Beijing and Moscow? If so, why?
Yeah, it's a great question. The biggest, I think, difference that this makes to the American idea of threat perception is it very much it follows in line with this idea of a renewed interest in great power conflict. In some senses, it is very much in the playbook of the latest thinking in the Pentagon, started under the Trump administration, that the era of the global war on terror, for example, is coming to an end. Idea that is being replaced by, or should be replaced by, a focus on great power conflict, namely with countries like China and Russia. The notion that there is a mutual interest between these two, in some senses, is the worst case scenario, I suppose, from a threat perception perspective from the American military, in the sense that now you're not dealing with necessarily two adversaries that can be played off against each other, but if they actually do share mutual interests, they're able to provide or present a united front against the United States. I think the idea of joint interoperability and joint capability is probably the least important aspect of these exercises. I think the first, as you mentioned, is this demonstration of bilateral goodwill, that there are areas in which China and Russia share interests. That's not necessarily an alliance. It's not necessarily globally that these countries share those interests, but certainly when we're talking about the areas of Central Asia and what they label as counterterrorism, which is largely now focused on the idea of stability in the region after Afghanistan. But I think we need to look beyond that in the numbers of individual capabilities that are being demonstrated. Missile technology, as you said, new weapons, aircraft, et cetera, that go well beyond what we would consider counterterrorism weapons. These are very much weapons used to fight a conventional war. And in that sense, it will certainly give pause to the United States as a realization that they're on the right track in terms of their threat assessments, but it is a worrying trend for sure.
Right. Just a quick follow-up question. Now, you know, the structural realists like John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt et al. have been talking about the fact that, well, you know, no one is giving a free pass to Russia. or the Russian ambitions in its former near abroad. But they also make the point that the whole idea of NATO expansion was something that was a mistake insofar as it kind of, it sort of, increased a sense of insecurity in Moscow, if you will. And so then Moscow obviously embarked on a pushback. So how much of that would you, consider as accurate assessment?
Well, I think Mearsheimer and Walt's theoretical perspective is interesting. I don't necessarily share it, but I think from an empirical perspective, the American attempt to do what they call containment or restraint or constraint, of countries like Russia and now of China is certainly problematic in the sense that when it's viewed from Beijing and Moscow, it doesn't look like a necessary defensive or peaceful strategy. It looks very much that you're being encircled, that the borders that you kind of set up and we're familiar with are being pushed closer and closer to you. So I think regardless of your theoretical orientation, if you flip the perspective and look at it from the perspective of Beijing or Moscow, being surrounded by American capability and allies certainly gives you a reason to develop your own, defensive capabilities, which lies at the heart of, I think, what Walt and Mearsheimer would say is the security dilemma, which means even defensive moves taken in quote unquote good faith by your adversaries certainly give you reason to increase your defenses, and that tends to enter into an escalatory spiral where your best efforts to defend yourself actually undermine your security overall because they give your adversary a reason to also increase their defensive capabilities.
Well, that's precisely why Memo called it the tragedy of great power politics, the structural bind or the securities trap, call it what you will. But stay with me, Professor Ankerson. Let me pull in Colonel Cheng here. Colonel Cheng, you heard this. It's an interesting, assessment that there's obviously a sense of insecurity, perhaps, for want of a better word, within the think tank and policy-making community in the United States with reference to not just China's increasing military capabilities, but also, the topic of this discussion, which is jointness between the Russian and Chinese militaries. So give me a sense from the Chinese perspective of how China looks at it in terms of increasing cooperation with Moscow.
First, I believe this is a very special military exercise, maybe the largest among the previous ones. And also it is held at a very special time and place, which is of extraordinary significance. There are many important points in this military exercise. First of all, I would like to remind you that the 8 Chinese characters shown on the exercise film. The meaning of the 8 Chinese characters is that China, Russia join hands to build peace. And this exercise focuses on jointly maintaining regional security and stability. In the first stage, the focus is to drill the joint commands, judgment, consultation, determination, organization, and coordination, etc. In the second stage, the key point is to carry out joint command deployment, firepower assault on the enemy, comprehensively destroy the enemy's combat system, and eliminate the enemy in depth. So far as the concept of military alliance, I think there is development. Military alliance I believe, is an old concept, and we have developed a new concept. I have noticed that the outside world is very much concerned about whether China and Russia will eventually form a military alliance. On this issue, I would like to make the following points. The first is that China pursues world peaceful coexistence. That is, all the countries live in peaceful environment. And China opposes confrontation between military alliances. We're against the military alliances, especially the military confrontation. So we should, give up the old concept, have new concept. The second point is that I believe China and Russia are now the most important force in maintaining world peace. Pakistan and the vast majority of both developed and developing countries in the world are also committed to maintaining regional and world peace. The third is that the United States is now, everybody can see, is now the biggest destroyer of world peace. The whole world should, that's why the whole world should unite to stop the United States from undermining world peace.
Okay.
The fourth point is that the current comprehensive strategic partnership and coordination between China and Russia is operating at a high level, which is not limited by military alliance. It is not limited by military alliance and has unlimited development space. And the fifth point is that I'm pleased to see that in recent years, Russia-Pakistan relations in various fields, including the military field, have continued to develop, which is conducive to maintaining regional peace. The last point is that India and Russia in the past had traditional friendly and cooperative relations. Now India and the United States are getting closer and closer. That is to say, India is trying to join the destructive force of the United States, which has a potential impact on the peace and stability in our region. In this regard, we should remain highly vigilant. Thank you.
Right. So that was Colonel Cheng, and just tabulated some of the points that he wanted to put across. So let me pull in Dr. Luzin here. Dr. Luzin, you heard Professor Ankerson, you heard Colonel Cheng. Now, there are areas of close interest between Russia and Beijing. We have seen that. There were areas where the Russian military was superior to the Chinese military, but over some years now, the Chinese are developing platforms and equipment which is superior to what the Russians can produce at this point. There is also a sense of competition between Russia and China in Central Asia, but of course there are also areas of convergence. So, can you unpack this sort of conundrum for us in terms of whether Russia would actually accept the Chinese influence in Central Asia, whether that is an area where the two can actually cooperate rather than compete, and so on?
Firstly, Russia tries to maintain its active role in Indo-Pacific regions. So currently, Russia is conducting not only bilateral exercises with China, but also at the same time, today, Russia is conducting the bilateral military exercises with India in central military district of Russia. So Russia tries to balance its policy in Indo-Pacific region. It cooperates as with China, as with India, as with Pakistan. There are some mostly economic, not military, but nevertheless some relations with Taiwan, with Indonesia, with Russia tries to be not too close to China. Moscow tries to be not too close to Beijing. At the same time, of course, Russia tries to demonstrate to the Western powers that, look, guys, we have good relations, military relations with China. Deal with us. But at the same time, Russia doesn't want to be too close to China. Also, during this Russia-Chinese exercises, the Russian military officers are using Chinese military equipment. For example, they're using Chinese wheeled tanks that Russia does not possess currently. And 10 years ago, Russia thought about possessing of wheeled tanks. That time, Russia decided not to do this. But currently, maybe Russia will analyze this equipment and will do something similar, or at least the Russian military officers will understand how the Chinese military equipment works, how the Chinese military equipment may be used not only somewhere in Indo-Pacific regions, but also somewhere in Central Asia. So, and these exercises give Russia an understanding how to deal with China, not only in friend relations, but maybe in future we will have not so close friendly relations, and we will have to understand how to deal with Chinese military in different situations.
That's a very interesting point, because I'm going to actually read out an excerpt, and this is, since I'm going to take this to Professor Ankerson. So this is a paper which was put out by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's in Washington, D.C. And it basically says that in terms of diplomacy and power projection, participation in these drills enables the two governments to signal reciprocal support. Through such defense cooperation, Moscow can affirm to Beijing its friendly intention and trust, while gaining insights into the PLA's evolving military capabilities. Now, this is precisely the point that Dr. Luzin was making. Indeed, previous Sino-Russian naval drills have not shied away from regional hotspots. Beijing and Moscow seem to have agreed to take turns holding maritime maneuvers in regions where one party wants to project power and highlight their cooperation with other powerful militaries. But essentially, the point about gaining insight into the PLA platform, systems, doctrines, a way of operating is what the CSIS assessment says, which I've just read out, and which was the point that Dr. Luzin was making. So, Professor Ankerson, clearly, from the Russian perspective, this is not something where they're going to jump on to the Chinese bandwagon, if you will. It's more about keeping China on the right side, getting the Chinese support for certain Russian interests and initiatives on the world stage, but also realizing, as per Dr. Luzin, that this is a relationship which can also sort of turn the other way.
No, absolutely. I think that dimension that Dr. Luzin brought up is extremely important. There's also, I think, a mutual learning going on from the Chinese perspective. The PLA has long been criticized as having lacking operational experience. So despite technological advances, it hasn't necessarily been involved in external fighting since the late 1970s, and therefore it gains an opportunity to work with Russia to also learn not only about interoperability, but pick up issues of tactics and procedures on how to conduct military operations in the contemporary world. So yes, there is absolutely a mutual information exchange that doesn't necessarily meet the kind of public relations points that are being brought up. I think the idea of Russia and China not being a global alliance, which everybody is keen to point out, I think is very useful, not only because they don't necessarily share objectives and interests globally, but also there's this feeling, largely borne out by history, that the two countries are not necessarily going to, not just not share interests, but have interests that are going to be competing. Moreover, the relationship between China and Russia may not be as both parties would like, in the sense that who's going to be the junior partner. In the past, it was always assumed that China would be the junior partner in any kind of relationship. Now, I think with the economic and technological developments, that's certainly not the case. And Russia may not be interested in hitching itself to a partnership, strategic partnership or alliance, where they come out as the junior partner. So I think this idea of mutual benefit is limited. There are things that they can learn from each other. There's mutual areas of interest, like Central Asia, like what they refer to as counterterrorism operations in and around Afghanistan. But we shouldn't necessarily take this to be a global amity relationship that's going to be long enduring.
That's an important point, and it kind of, history also, bears it out in the sense that, there are two great powers, two civilizational powers, as a matter of fact, and if we apply structural realism to it, we do realize that even if they have a sense of cooperation at some stage, essentially they will be going towards peer competition. But before I wrap up, let me pull in Colonel Cheng Shizhong back into this discussion. Colonel Cheng, you heard Dr. Luzin. So Russia has interests with China. Russia would very much want to have a cooperative framework with China. But then Russia considers itself a great power. And so Russia has its own interests also, and its own reasons for balancing things. For instance, Dr. Luzin mentioned the ongoing military exercises with India, for that matter. You also talked about Taiwan, which obviously is a red rag to the Chinese bull. You talked about Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam and China do not see eye to eye on a number of issues. As a matter of fact, Professor Ankerson was talking about, PLA's operations. The last one, 1979, was around with Vietnam. So does China realize that, dealing with Russia is something where it's dealing with a state that also considers itself a great power, is probably not going to play second fiddle to China?
About what my Russian friend said, some points okay, but some points I do not agree. And I don't believe Russia has any substantial, particularly military relations with Taiwan. Russia does not have any military relations or official relations with Taiwan, because on this issue, China is very sensitive. Russia knows. Maybe there are some economic relations, trade relations, only this. And about China and Russia, I think we are having the best relations now since the history. And I would like to remind you about the recent leaders meeting. China and Russia strive to promote the high-level cooperation of comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership in the new era, and give play to the role of the two countries as anchors of world strategic balance and stability. About 3 months ago, now 2.5 months ago, on June 28th this year, the top leaders of China and Russia held a video meeting and issued a joint statement formally extending China-Russia Treaty of good neighborliness, friendship, and cooperation. there are many important new statements in this joint statement, including one statement that is the most important, I consider. Russia needs a progress and a stable China, and China needs a strong and successful Russia. We wish to see a strong Russia.
Yeah, China is the biggest. China is the trading partner of Russia. I'm sorry I intervened, Colonel Cheng, but I've run out of time. Thank you so much, as always, for your insights. Thank you to Dr. Pavel Luzin also, and to Dr. Christopher Ankerson. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Russian military's joint exercises with Uzbek and Tajik militaries. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Soldiers from Russia, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan held joint military drills just 20 kilometers from the Tajikistan-Afghanistan border. The drills concluded on Tuesday. Russia, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have held two separate sets of military exercises close to Afghanistan this month as Taliban fighters overran much of the country's northern provinces. Tajik Defense Minister Sher Ali Mirzo told reporters at the training grounds that the drills were being held with Afghanistan in the mind. The situation in Afghanistan is unpredictable, he said. The drills involved 2,500 servicemen, hundreds of armored vehicles and 25 aircraft. The Russian forces involved came from the military base located in Tajikistan, which is Moscow's biggest facility abroad. Interestingly, Russia is also holding a large-scale joint military exercise with China in the northwestern Ningxia region. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Blank, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Dr. Ariel Cohen, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Thank you to all the panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Blank here. Dr. Blank, is this part of what Russia has, what they call CESTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization? Is this a signal to the Taliban? Is this a preemptive sort of strategy to say that these borders must not be crossed? How do you read into these exercises?
First of all, the exercises with Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan are connected to the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And they are a signal to the Taliban that we will defend these countries under that treaty. The problem is that tanks and aircraft are not going to do the job, as we've seen before. But it's a signal that we are prepared to defend this area against any incursions or invasions by the Taliban or by terrorist groups associated with the Taliban into Central Asia. The exercises with China are a different matter. They are a signal to a whole series of audiences, not least of which is India, certainly the United States, of the Russo-Chinese alliance. And this is an alliance, I believe, that it exists de facto, although not de jure. And we see it in ever more sophisticated and intimate military coordination, such as these kinds of exercises. So these are two prongs, if you like, of Russian policy in Central and South Asia. One, to defend the members of the CSTO, as stipulated in the treaty. And second, the Russo-Chinese Entente or alliance also is a signal to Taliban, certainly, but to many more audiences besides.
Okay. Let me bring Dr. Ariel Cohen here. So just to problematize this, Dr. Cohen, Central Asia is an area which Russia considers to be its near abroad, its area of influence. This is also an area in which China is deeply interested. So while there are areas of convergence between China and Russia, there are also areas of divergence. And I believe I just did a segment before this one, and I had, with reference to the Chinese-Russian military exercises, and I had, Dr. Luzin from Russia, who said, look, there is no concept of us being a junior partner because Russia is a great power. So this is something where it's a dilemma for Russia, perhaps, and also for China to have to be partner in certain areas, but also be wary of each other in that structural sense, where you have a structural bind, where you have two powers, both powers that consider themselves to be hegemons.
Absolutely. And what you see here is yet another iteration of the great game, this time with China quickly emerging as the great power in the heart of Eurasia, and Russia, which was so far quite happy to be the security contractor for Central Asia. China was happy to outsource its security concerns and problems, not paying 1 yuan for it. Russia took all the expenses, and China was expanding its economic power and presence through the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Now the game is diverging. I don't think they are very well coordinated despite this joint military exercise. Why? Because China is the great friend of Pakistan. Pakistan's ISI, military intelligence, is the guide and the sugar daddy of the Taliban. So with one layer, once removed, China will be in the position to influence and direct the Taliban. Russia is playing a different game. Russia wants to talk to everybody. Russia is in Doha talking to China and India and Iran and the current government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. But Russia is not in the predominant position vis-a-vis the Taliban. China is. So the potential for a confrontation in the great game in the future, not now. In the great game, there are no friends, only interests. That was the case between the US and the Soviet Union, between the Soviet Union and China, and before that, between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. So eventually, the interests of Russia trying to protect its allies for the Commonwealth Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, or Collective Security Treaty Organization, and China, that may have different priorities, may not recognize Russian predominance in Central Asia. The potential for that friction is there.
Okay. Kamran Bukhari. So how do we look at this? Russians on the one hand, and this is not my assessment, this is the US assessment of Russian support, arms and funding for the Taliban. And the US intelligence started talking about it back in 2018. And now, of course, the Taliban advances continuing, and the Russians are doing these exercises with its Central Asian partners. So is this about a policy which at one level wanted the US out, but is also wary of a complete Taliban victory?
Absolutely, Ijaz. I think that if you look at Russian behavior, as long as the United States was stuck in Afghanistan, that worked well for the Russian interests. A U.S. in a problematic situation, whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq in the past, this is all, from the Kremlin's point of view, this is good. So in order to be able to ensure that, it's not a big deal for the Kremlin's security services working with the Central Asian republics, and the Kremlin has a lot of influence in Afghanistan, even though it left the country back in '89. So there are channels through which the Russians may have supplied weapons. We don't know to what extent and what other forms of assistance was given, because this was to keep the U.S. bogged down. Does that mean that the Kremlin wanted to empower the Taliban? No, it's a balancing act. The Kremlin did not want to give up its relations with the anti-Taliban camp and the Afghan government. And obviously, given its latest behavior in trying to demonstrate that it will defend the borders of the Central Asian states, it did not want to threaten them either. So now we have this balancing act, excuse me, and then of course there's the ISIS factor. So if ISIS and the Taliban are enemies, then we can see countries like Iran and Russia basically supporting one side over the other in order to make sure that the ISIS threat remain contained. ISIS hasn't really emerged as a major threat. So now the question is, we have a new situation with the U.S. withdrawal and the Taliban taking over about 10 provincial capitals, and that's concerning for the Russians because this is now the pendulum swinging in the extreme opposite direction, which is also not in the Russian interest. So it makes sense for what they did in the past, and they definitely still have channels with the Taliban. The Taliban were in Russia recently. The foreign minister had some nice words for the Taliban. And so this is where you play both sides because you don't know who is going to emerge where. And I mean, this is statecraft.
Okay. Dr. Blank, you said something interesting that, with reference to aircraft and other platforms, which are generally used more for, conventional military operations. Could it be that the Russians and the Central Asians are also signaling to the Taliban that in the event the Taliban, and of course, we're jumping ahead of the curve, but just for the sake of the argument, that if the Taliban do establish control over Afghanistan, from an insurgent movement, they will turn into a government. There'll no more be an elusive adversary. They will be on the ground. And those are targets against which you can use missiles. Those are targets against which you can use traditional means of firepower. Could that be one of the reasons why the Russians and the Central Asians are exercising in terms of the use of conventional weapons platforms?
Well, yes, but it's also because that's what they have. As the late Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army you have. The Russians do not have the kind of guerrilla light armed forces that they can spare to send to Central Asia in large numbers. So this is a demonstration of power and force. And your point is well taken, that if and when the Taliban becomes a state, they have something to lose, and Russia's showing what actually they could lose if they made trouble in Central Asia. The point, however, is that Russia is not an enemy of the Taliban. As Kamran said, they are playing a balancing game. Russia has been selling arms and sharing intelligence with the Taliban since 2013, and they have improved their relationship with Pakistan since then as well, very possibly as a result of Chinese suggestions. And this was clear several years ago when I wrote about it. It's even clearer now. So the Russians are going to have a major voice in Afghanistan, come what may, but they want to make sure that nobody crosses, quote, their red lines, end quote, into Central Asia. I think that this is not going to convince the terrorists who are fighting with the Taliban, or frankly the Taliban themselves, to stay in Afghanistan. Terrorist movements don't become statesmen overnight, and there's no sign that this is likely with the Taliban. But this is the harvest that Russia has reaped from its previous policies. Okay.
Dr. Ariel Cohen, do you agree with what Dr. Blank is saying with reference to the Russian support, as I said earlier? In fact, he's taken it back to 2013. But at least in 2018, the U.S. intelligence began voicing this rather openly, that there are these relations, and the Russians will have some influence in Afghanistan with reference to the Taliban.
Absolutely. And the Russians want to play the game as long as that game is not endangering their vital interests. Look, this is the most important security challenge to the post-communist Russia, bar none. The West never was as unpredictable or threatening to the allies of Russia as Taliban maybe, or extremist movements that are aligned with the Taliban are today. Russia might find itself fighting side by side with the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Turkmen. Whether they're going to do it in a sustainable way or not, and do they have a chance, I don't know. I was carefully looking at the pictures you were showing of the Russian military training. And on the one hand, these helicopters and airplanes are either the same models or slightly improved models of what we saw the Soviets deployed in Afghanistan 30 plus years ago. The tactics are very similar. Some of the special forces, jumping with parachutes. Nobody jumps with parachutes anymore. But at the same time, some equipment looks better, the uniforms, the sidearms, but it's basically the same old Soviet plus military, whereas what they need is semi-irregular, light special forces to defeat the Taliban. Their chances, if the clashes start along the Tajik border, are not very good. And if China is behind, and China is directing it up to and including weakening Russia in the long term, maintaining plausible deniability, that is a very serious challenge for Russia. It's a serious challenge for Russia-built political structure, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So if I were Russian if I was a Russian planner or Russian policymaker, I would be losing my sleep at night over these developments in Central Asia. And it's not going to happen tomorrow. It will take several months for the Taliban to consolidate its power. It was mentioned here that in a month to 6 weeks, they captured up to 10 provincial capitals. It looks like the Afghan army is not doing well. The majority of countryside is already controlled by the Taliban. So it's not going to happen tomorrow. But where the Russian troops are going to be in a year, what are they going to do? Big question mark here. And I just don't see that military being battle-worthy and tough enough for a big regional war in Central Asia.
I suspect revisiting these developments again. I silently chuckled when you mentioned the Russians' equipment. I wish we had time to actually discuss some of the small arms that Russia has developed. And frankly, as an ever shooter myself, I trust my life with an AK anytime. But that's a separate topic altogether. And your statement that the Afghan army hasn't done so well is a great understatement. But thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Blank. Thank you, Dr. Ariel Kern. Thank you to Dr. Kamran Bukhari. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.